it may seem almost cliche that we're focused on mentoring because mentoring is such a staple of the entrepreneurial process. In fact, I remember back when we were contemplating the Nelson Center's launch, even before I was part of the group with Jason Harry and a number of others who were working on this strategy. And I personally was in charge of the thought process behind mentorship. And so even prior to the Nelson Center's launch, this was a priority, and I knew it would be when we launched. What I didn't know is that I didn't know how consequential it would become as soon as we opened our doors. I know that Jonas and Liz, who along with me were the three first staff people we had at the Nelson Center, no sooner than we opened our doors in September of 2016, and we had, I would call it a deluge of students who were super excited and enthusiastic. And we thought, oh my God, how are three of us going to mentor all these students, literally hundreds of students? And we deputized some of my former students as peer entrepreneurs and residents. We contemplated having an entrepreneur in residence program. And really, to thank all of you, many of you came forward and said, I'll volunteer, I'll be a mentor. I have some experience that I'd like to give. And I see many familiar faces here who were there in those early days. Deb Mills Schofield, who is now a mentoring maven. She's been so active as a mentor. We designated her a mentoring maven. I know Rob Kagan is here. I don't want to leave anybody out, so I'm not going to try to even think about an exhaustive list here. But thank you to so many of you who did step up. And before we knew it, we had, and we now have, well over 500, mostly Brown alumni, who are active as mentors and helping us in other ways. Because suffice it to say, there is no way that Liz and Jonas and I, and now Sheila and Abby and Alyssa and Jason and Jen and just still a small staff could do anywhere near what we're doing without the real generous and diligent engagement of so many of you. So first thing I wanted to do was thank you, because you've been involved since day one, and we couldn't imagine doing what we're doing without such a supportive cast. Now, what we didn't do in those first days is do any deliberate training. We just said, please come aboard and help us. And yet what we've heard, especially lately, is, gee, it might be nice to circle back. We've heard from students. We've heard from some of you who have been mentors. We ourselves, as staff people who spend a lot of time mentoring students, acknowledge that we could use some training in how to be an even better mentor, because mentorship is challenging. We're putting ourselves out there. Students are looking for our expertise, but it's not only do we just dump what's in our heads onto the table of the students. How do we interact with students in a more maybe respectful, deliberate, expansive way? And so we are kicking this event off as one of what we know will be a series of events on training for mentors over the next several months and probably years. So one thing to say is we want to look to you, and just like this is being responsive to you already, if there are topics that you are interested in that we could address, we would really appreciate hearing from you. And so anytime you want, you can drop us a line, maybe at entrepreneurship@brown.edu, and just let us know, and we'd be very happy to be responsive as we were today. So before I move on, I wanted to acknowledge that we did not know how many people would even have an interest in doing what we're doing today. We thought, I think Liz said she estimated, I don't know, between 10 and 20 people. I noticed that we have 57 participants, and we had 80 people register, and we always have a little bit of melt. I wanted to turn this over to, and by the way, we have people from all over the world, including Spain and France and Germany and Italy and Kenya and lots of US cities. I want to turn this over real briefly to Jonas, because he has a very special announcement to make. Very brief, because we're going to transition to Banu in a second, but it's exciting to hear the announcement.
Thanks, Danny. Jonas here. I will be very brief. And in fact, there's a formal email announcement coming out about this later next week. But we thought we would give you guys a sneak preview that we have 3 new entrepreneurs in residence this year, coming on the heels of some spectacular entrepreneurs in residence we've had in the past. Arnell is here. Laura Thompson was an EIR this past year. But upcoming, the 3 are Richie Holmes Grant, who is on the call. Hi, Richie, class of '99. Welcome. We're very, very excited. I saw Ben Chesler, class of '15, also on the call. Ben is lurking here in the Zoom Brady Bunch somewhere. Ben, welcome to the team. We're very excited to have you. And last but not least is Lorraine Pendleton, class of '91, who is also here joining us today. So we're just super excited to do this. The first year we had 1 entrepreneur in residence and we had so much fun. The next year we had 2 and we had so much fun doing it that this year we couldn't help ourselves in taking 3. So these folks are incredibly beneficial mentors for our community. I don't need to tell you that, but I just wanted to pass that news along and keep your eyes peeled for a formal announcement introducing them and all of their experience and accomplishments next week.
We thought we would take the opportunity right now to make that real special announcement, and we're really happy to have all 3 of you on board because a lot of what you do as EIRs, as Arnell can attest and as Laura could or Jessica could have, is mentorship. And so it's appropriate that you're with us today. Okay, I want to get us started in the meat of the event and indicate, first of all, that I think it's appropriate that we are focusing on inclusive mentorship as the theme for today for all sorts of reasons, some of which I think are self-evident, some of which will be clear when Banu gets started. And also because it's one of the issues, whether or not you framed it in exactly those words, that we heard from you as being one of the training issues that would be high in your list. So I am really excited to introduce Professor Banu Ozkazanc-Pan. And I'm not going to give her a big, long introduction, although she certainly deserves it, because I said I would allow her to expand on the little bit I say. But suffice it to say that a few years ago, I met Banu and I said, whoa, you are teaching part-time here at Brown? She was teaching a course after a national search in sociology on leadership. And I said, how can we get you here full-time? And Banu knew that if I set my mind to doing something like that, I'll make it happen. And it took some effort, as it shouldn't have. It should have been easy, but you know, things are sometimes challenging in a university environment. And I made the case to Rick Locke and he said, oh my God, I've heard great things about Banu, absolutely. And he invited her onto his future of work faculty working group, and she started teaching more courses. She is a prolific author. She has 2 books coming out from Cambridge University Press, not just one. She is a frequent contributor on national news. She testified before the Senate last year, is an authority on understanding effective diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and policies in entrepreneurship in the venture capital industry. In terms of her proximity to the Nelson Center, she is also the director of the Venture Capital Inclusion Lab, which maybe some of you are involved with or hear more about. And I really appreciate, Banu, you're taking some time to be with us to share some of your expertise and facilitate today. So I'm sure you'll share a little bit more detail along the way, and we'll turn it over to you. Thank you so much, Banu.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny, for a very generous and kind introduction. I will get started by sharing my screen so that any additional items that I add about myself are kind of contextualized. So I am really excited to be here today talking about inclusion in the context of mentorship, which is one important element of entrepreneurship in general. So I will tell you a little bit more about myself and why I care so much about this. We'll go on to talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion in entrepreneurship investing, and then maybe provide a little bit of a framework for thinking about mentorship in an inclusive sense, and make time for discussion, Q&A as we move along. And if there is something along the way that you'd like me to address further, I'm happy to do that as well. My reason for being interested in this is mostly due to the way I was raised. I am originally from Turkey. I was raised in Saudi Arabia. I went to boarding school in Switzerland, and then I came to the US. So all along the way, there were instances in which I was either an insider or an outsider, having access or not to multiple different elements of society or the economy. And for me, this has really been a guiding principle for my research, trying to understand why we see exclusion happen, particularly in contexts where explicitly people want to change some of those dynamics. And venture capital and entrepreneurship happens to be one of those spaces. So when I focus on mentoring, it really is to understand, is there one piece in sort of the structure of entrepreneurship and investing that we can try to mitigate to ensure that there is opportunity for everyone who wants to become a successful entrepreneur. So I'll start that conversation with kind of sharing with you statistics that maybe are at this point not that unfamiliar in terms of looking at the numbers related to gender and to race and ethnicity, particularly in venture capital investing. And I focus here because ultimately, I think many of the folks that you're mentoring at some point want to launch ventures, which will hopefully eventually be funded, maybe by VCs or other investment professionals. And how do we eventually change these dynamics? So I believe mentoring is a really important part of that. So I really want to understand mentoring within context and hopefully provide you with some ideas and details around what we could do differently. As an academic, it's always important for me to kind of share what I mean when I say diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I just want to briefly touch upon these because I'm sure at this point, particularly in the US, after Me Too and after Black Lives Matter, we've heard many of these terms being used much more explicitly than potentially in previous years. So when we say diversity, we're really talking about the ways that people talk about and understand differences between and among people. And some of these are invisible and some of these are more visible, although we can't always attribute that gender and race, that what we see is necessarily how people feel about themselves. They're also relational and contextual. How we understand race and ethnicity, for example, in the US, doesn't always translate to other cultural contexts. So we have to be mindful of that, and that how people differentiate themselves across different countries and societies is quite different. You've probably also heard the word equity, and it really is an outcome rather than necessarily just a concept. It's the outcome of treating people with fairness and justice. And I want to just emphasize it's not the same as equality, because equity recognizes people start out in life in very different places. And so the resources and opportunity structures available to everyone are a little bit different. And then lastly, the idea of inclusion, which is, again, I think of it as an outcome of the practices that we engage in to include especially underserved, disadvantaged groups. So it's quite intentional. And again, it's relational and contextual, meaning in different contexts, inclusion might look differently. You'll notice very much so that the idea of belonging is not included in here, and that's on purpose. We have very limited time today, and belonging is only possible if we have diversity, equity, and inclusion in place to create a sense that everyone belongs in particular spaces, including that of entrepreneurship. So why does it matter? I think, again, maybe many of you are well aware of this, but diversity has dividends in terms of successful performance, both in terms of financials, but also innovation. Diverse teams tend to be more innovative. And another reason we want to probably think about diversity in the context of the US is that there are significant demographic shifts happening, where actually last year the under 18 population was majority minority for the first time. And that's actually going to increase in the coming years, where the majority of the population will be non-white, which means new opportunities, new investors, new markets, new entrepreneurs are going to be emerging. And it's important to understand the opportunities that that will create for everyone. I want to get into mentoring. As I mentioned, I think mentoring is a really important part of the entrepreneurial journey. And I define it here very simply as the sharing of information, knowledge, and experience with another person. Sometimes you will hear this defined in a manner that assumes a particular kind of hierarchy. And I am explicitly staying away from that because I believe that it can be mutually beneficial and a mutual learning experience. There are many reasons people want to engage in mentoring, and I think that's really important to identify because depending on why people engage in in mentorship, it can lead to different reasons as to why they may or may not want to sometimes change some of their practices. In many ways, mentoring is not necessarily a one-way street. It can expand our own ideas about people that are very different from us in the world, other cultures, other places, and in general, the social world. And I think it can be a really important avenue for impacting some of the inequities that we see in entrepreneurship by opening up opportunities for those who have been historically disadvantaged. And while that term seems like a deficit, I think one way to think about entrepreneurs who come from backgrounds that have been left out of the opportunity structures are new majority founders, because we are seeing a shift in who is becoming an entrepreneur and who ultimately is going to be impacting the landscape of investing. And while mentoring can be incredibly important and beneficial, there are certain challenges that are also associated with it, mostly due to the fact that we are human beings, imperfect, engaging with each other, and we come with our own set of ideas. And there are certain elements that I've seen in my work, both in terms of looking at entrepreneurship dynamics, but also for many years having taught cross-cultural management to MBA students and undergraduates, to kind of get a sense of where do these challenges arise, particularly when people of different backgrounds start engaging with each other. And one of the areas is that in a mentoring relationship, there can be a level of antagonism and a power struggle that emerges when individuals feel that the knowledge that they have is important and should dominate the understanding of the situation. There can be an assumed hierarchy of knowledge where the mentor potentially feels that his or her or their knowledge is correct and almost imposes it on the mentee. Other challenges can arise when we are not as mindful of personal boundaries and not establishing mutual respect when we're engaging in mentoring. And while we may be respectful person or feel that we are good at these things, I think being explicit about them is really, really important, and I'll get to what that might look like. Hearing but not listening, I would say, is one of the greatest challenges related to how people think they hear something, but they're not listening in a manner that allows them to understand what is being said to them. I think the idea of implicit assumptions is another area in which we've seen many potential challenges arise. Currently, you'll see a lot of folks trying to engage in unconscious bias training, understand the idea of implicit bias. And a lot of this work comes to us from psychology, which is important and interesting, but it's also important to understand that biases come from a variety of places in terms of our experiences and worldviews, and they can be based on our understanding of gender or race, ethnicity, or any other dimension that are written here or not, and really allow us to have a particular understanding of these issues that come to surface maybe when we're engaged with people whose assumptions are very different than ours. And they may not surface in a manner that we expect, but it can still be difficult. I would say difficult conversations are another challenge that we can potentially face when mentoring. And the reason these come up is in instances where we want to deliver much needed and potentially difficult feedback. We end up not doing it because we feel that it makes either us uncomfortable or potentially the person who is the receiving end of this feedback uncomfortable. And what that can do, particularly in contexts where a person who needs this feedback doesn't get it, is at the end of the day, they might end up moving through and not having that feedback and ultimately not doing well, and that being attributed to their potential gender or race. I've seen this happen quite a bit where it is uncomfortable for a particular mentor to deliver feedback simply based on feeling uncomfortable about the gender and race of their mentee, feeling that it might be taken the wrong way, so they don't do it, but it's actually quite necessary. And then lastly, unintended consequences. Nobody wants to be seen as offensive or insensitive, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, understanding how these consequences emerge, I think, is really important and could be a really important learning opportunity. So to be misunderstood, to have miscommunicated, these are all things we do as human beings, but understanding how your message might have been misconstrued is an important learning experience, particularly related to understanding who your audience is when you have a mentoring relationship. So if you want to start thinking about becoming an inclusive mentor, what does that even mean? And, rather than define it, I think everyone has to kind of come to that in terms of their own ideas and experiences. You can start by asking yourself a series of questions related to your assumptions about other people and the social world. One of the ways I try to engage this, particularly when I'm talking to teams or groups of individuals who maybe come from very different backgrounds, is how do you think about other people? So it's really almost an exercise of thinking about thinking, which might sound a bit meta or philosophical, but ultimately it's trying to uncover your own assumptions, which is helpful going forward because clearly in some instances, your own assumptions of the world will not be aligned with those of the folks that you're trying to have a relationship with in terms of a mentoring context. Clearly setting goals and expectations for mentoring. So what is the intended outcome or outcomes of the relationship? It's lovely to have someone to talk to, but what is really the expectation here in terms of you as a mentor and potentially your mentee? I think the operative word here is mutually set clear goals and expectations to, again, rethink the idea of a knowledge hierarchy that you are potentially there to learn as a mentor as well. The third point is focusing on orientation. This is really important because sometimes people have a real task or transactional orientation, meaning they're there to get something done, to exchange information, rather than necessarily to build a relationship. And on the other hand, sometimes people believe that it's really about having a conversation, and there may or may not be a task associated with it. So what I would suggest is you understand the orientation that you come from and whether or not that's aligned with that of your mentee. And is there an opportunity to have both orientations because they are both equally valuable, even if different from each other. The fourth area to think about is clear communication. Obviously written, oral, or emoji based. And I say this because for folks who are neurodivergent, sometimes words that are written do not have the same representation or understanding or interpretation that we might think about, given that their interpretation of it might be quite different. So there are now ways in which when you have something that you've written and it's meant to be just a joke, that you would do \JK to say just kidding, to really kind of emphasize these might seem very small nuanced things to those folks whose interpretation is going to be maybe a little bit different. Fifth area is thinking about empathy as a foundation for trust. How do we grow and think about empathy? And I think that's a really important part of mentoring, to understand and listen through an empathic lens. And as a foundation for building trust, it's a learned behavior, and it takes some time, but it is quite important. 6 is listening and understanding. And one way to reinforce this is to repeat what you have heard and to ask if your interpretation of it is correct. So what I hear you say is X, is this correct? And in contexts where there might be some different understanding of situations, I think this is quite important. And lastly, for you as a person, really learn to identify those triggers, those situations, conversations, potentially sharing of experiences, which lead to discomfort, either on your part or that of the mentee, and to understand what it was that potentially triggered that discomfort. So emotions and keeping those in terms of understanding your emotions and how they're arising is really important. I'm going to focus explicitly on gender and cultural competence because these are areas where we have seen many difficult situations and conversations arise. And again, given sort of the short time that we have, I'm really just kind of doing a little bit of a overview of what are some of the things that you may need to think about as we engage in mentoring relationships with people whose ideas around gender and whose cultural experiences might be quite different than our own. So one is that our implicit assumptions can be very difficult to articulate. And that means that these are learned ideas, learned behaviors, where we may not always be able to identify them and say, yeah, I definitely have these views of these kinds of people. But they can surface when we are engaged in a mentoring relationship and we find ourselves asking questions like, where are you from? To someone who you believe may or may not be from where you think they are. Or you say something along the lines of, oh, you speak so well. And another one, I actually get this quite a bit, is I wasn't sure if you're a man or a woman from your name. And you don't look Muslim, but you can, substitute any other attribute there. And a lot of times we don't say these things, sentences and questions like these, because we're trying to be mean, we're trying to be insensitive. On the contrary, we're actually trying to establish a relationship with someone. But in reality, what these kinds of questions surface is that you have implicit assumptions about the kind of person that you're talking to and where they might be from, who they might be, and the ways in which they're behaving. So when you ask questions like this, or you hear questions like this, it's important to get a sense of what must have been my assumption that I wanted to ask this person where they're from. So in that sense, keeping track of the kinds of questions you're asking or that are being asked of you, I think is really important because it can surface some of these implicit assumptions around gender, culture, or any other attribute where the intention and the outcome are not necessarily aligned. Another idea is really thinking about gender not as a biological determinant or sex or a binary, but to understand that for many people it is fluid. And one way to think about being inclusive is to ask for preferred pronouns, which right now I think you'll see many people introduce themselves as, hi, I'm Banu, I go by she, hers, or someone who might say, I go by they, them. And I think this is important to establish that level of trust in a relationship. Insider and outsider knowledge of cultures, this really comes from the work of anthropologists who tell us that when we're trying to understand different cultures, it matters whether or not you experience that culture firsthand by being raised in it, or you experienced it by going there in another manner. So there are many people in the world who travel between different sites and locations, so transnational people, so their knowledge of cultures is much more fluid. So what I would say is think about whether your understanding of another culture comes from being immersed in it, having grown up in it, or does it come from something that's a little bit more on the outside and you can understand that there's much more for you to learn. And then lastly, the idea of cultural differences. These are really important and they can be a wonderful learning opportunity. And I would say consider the fact that cultural differences can emerge in unexpected ways. So just because someone comes from a very different culture than you doesn't mean you don't have shared values. but ultimately some of those cultural differences can lead to very different interpretations of situations, which is absolutely fine. But becoming aware of that so that you understand why somebody may or may not see the same issues that you raise in any mentoring relationship. And I promise you, this is my last academic slide. I know there's a lot of information here. I would say when we're thinking about inclusive mentorship, it's absolutely okay to feel uncomfortable when our assumptions get challenged. And in certain situations, that might really require us to rethink why we had those assumptions in the first place, whether they came from our upbringing, our experiences, and ultimately whether or not they're valid. They can absolutely be valid, but they can also be something that we want to become aware of. In this sense, learning, growth, and change will likely require some difficult conversations. And one way to think about it is to ask others around you what some of the ways they can think about your engagement with people. What are some of the ways they would describe you as a person, and whether that aligns with how you think of yourself. So one way to think of this is, ask yourself, what are my assumptions about person X or situation Y or conversation Z? How am I coming into this mentoring relationship? What are my preferences in terms of mentoring? And are those aligned with those of my mentee or mentees? One of the things that I often try to teach is we need to learn to unlearn. And this is really about expanding your framework and vocabulary to talk about people in the social world in ways that maybe you have not thought about, that you haven't been exposed to, but are really valuable as we see the world change, out there, and we want to understand what's happening. And then lastly, seeing and understanding the world differently isn't necessarily about agreeing with what's happening, but it's really setting up a sense of respect and mutual learning from a mentoring relationship, which I believe can be fostered to be much more inclusive if we take the time to ask ourselves some of these questions and maybe engage in some of these practices so that we can become better in terms of creating opportunities for people who may not have had them going forward. So I will stop there. I'll open it up to questions, thoughts, discussion points, and depending on that, we might also have an opportunity to do a little bit of a breakout session. So I will end here, and I'm happy to take questions, maybe either by chat or by, if I can see your hands, I will do that as well.
Well, Banu, since people are being shy, I will try to do an icebreaker. That was phenomenal. I learned a lot from that. And one thing that I find challenging in working with students, whether they're in class or in the breakthrough lab or whatnot, is how best to establish something more than a little bit of rapport without asking untoward probing questions and so forth. And so some of the questions that you cautioned us about might have seemed to me at first blush to be actually pretty safe territory, but hearing you talk about it, I could see that it might not be. So do you have any guidance about how to establish the rapport, recognize the differences that we likely have, but without creating discomfort?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jason. And each person will likely have sort of their own set of questions for engaging. And I would like, in my own personal practice to say, it's very nice to meet you. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself? What brought you to want to engage in mentoring, right? So it's very clear in terms of it's starting out with that relationship, and then going from there, you can expand to say, hey, what brought you to Brown, or what brought you to study or do this kind of startup? And so kind of start small but expand out. That's
And
what
maybe
I
more
do.
open, maybe more open-ended, so that you're not starting with the perceived difference, as you say, like I couldn't figure out if you were a man or a woman on the basis of your name. I could absolutely see that as getting pretty old on the receiving end.
Yeah, it does get old, I'll tell you that. But I think when you open with a question that's open-ended, it leaves it for the person to kind of fill in the blanks that they want to choose. When you ask a question that has a finite answer, like, where are you from?
Mm,
That closes down conversation before it starts it. And saying something like, oh, I didn't know if you're a man or a woman, there is no conversation there.
yeah,
So
right,
it's really
right.
not the question per se, but what that question accomplishes, which is, does it open up opportunities for further dialogue, or does it close it down to something that's going to be either one short answer
Right.
or something that doesn't even require a response.
Right. That's really, really helpful. Thank you. I'm going to do that. That's awesome.
I see Rob's question next. So I'm going to go there. How
Yeah,
do you
sure.
how do you like create that understanding of where others are coming from, tools and exercises? Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do is to think about, and it kind of depends. It depends if you're sort of engaging in a mentoring relationship that's longer term, or something that's maybe more office hours. Somebody kind of came and just really wanted advice. And it's really to understand how people are thinking about coming to you. And one of the questions you can ask is, oh, can you tell me a little bit more about why you're interested in mentoring? Can you tell me a little bit more about why you wanted to meet with me today? Can you tell me more about why you are interested in this startup that you have founded? So really, again, and I'm happy to provide you resources rather than just concrete examples, but it's really questions that open up opportunities for conversations rather than almost a checkbox of, well, why are you here today? Right? You still get similar information, but one opens it up to a dialogue where the other one requires just a very quick answer. And I know, Rob, you probably want more, and I'm happy to, in the PowerPoints that I shared, there's actually some resources at the end of it that can be useful. I'm gonna go to Caroline's question, which is, after some report is built, another idea is it okay if I take a risk right now before asking a question? Right. So you can definitely say, is it correct that I am thinking X about what you just said? And a lot of times people will say, maybe, no, or yes, absolutely. So you reiterate what the person said, repeat it, and ask them if your interpretation of it is correct. And I find that people will generally tend to use that opportunity to maybe nudge you in a little bit of a different direction if they need to.
Hello, Banu, if you allow me.
Yes, I am just gonna find who is speaking to me.
Yeah, it's Abdullah.
Hi, Abdullah. I now see
Hi.
you.
All right, great. So, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really amazing. I really learned a lot. I don't have like much of teaching experience, though I have like much of experience in meeting people and talk to people. I understood the fact that people has more tendency to feel comfortable when they start talking about things that interest them. So I would like to share my experience about how did I mentor. I met at least like so many like national and international events, including Startup Weekend, as everyone knows. And I learned that before starting any mentorship program, I should start what are the interests of the mentee. What is the thing that really likes to talk about? What is the thing that he likes to do? What is his passion? And people feel more comfortable to share what they have. And I always act as someone who doesn't understand a thing what they're talking. So I keep asking a question and take from that step into another step to what they do in the business. And we go from there and people are gonna feel more comfortable. Still, I face one of the challenges in every step in that is that the transition between a subject to another subject sometimes even it's relevant, but sometimes the mentee doesn't see it in a way that is relevant. So how can I communicate in a way more efficient so I can just make them understand that this is related to what we're gonna talk about the next topic. And most of the time they just rush. They want to go to the next topic. I want to scale up. I want to do that. As you know, everyone wants to scale up. I'm not sure if you understood me, but how can I take that from that to another topic?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Abdullah, no, thank you. And then Deb, I see your hand, so I'll come up to you next. So I think one of the ways is entrepreneurialism and entrepreneurship is a way of thinking, right? So if your mindset is linear and transactional and you're going to rush from point A to point whatever, you're going to miss some of those connections that require you to iterate. So go back, go back, go back. And I think one of the ways to instill that in a mentoring relationship is to say, you might see this as a tangent, but let me tell you why it's really important that you understand the relationship between these two parts, because that's actually what entrepreneurial thinking is about, is seeing connections when others may not. So I hope that's helpful, but you know, it's still work. It's still more work. Deb, I'm going to go to you and I'm going to try to find you on my Brady board here.
So, you know, having done a lot of mentoring, and I will ask Francesca, Lauren, I see Lauren, Francesca's on the next meeting. Any of you guys here that, you know, I've done mentoring for. For me, what's worked is I'm just being as much myself and admitting that I'm here to learn from you guys as much as you're here to learn from me. And in fact, honestly, the reason I mentor is because it's like grad school for free. Liz is cracking up, but I think I get more out of it. And so any questions I may ask, I want them to know, and I'll tell them I'm asking because I would like to learn from your experiences that are different than mine, just like anybody else's. And just being authentic about it. And I just think your demeanor, not just from an inclusivity standpoint, but it'll set the mentee at ease just by how you sit, posture, smile, chill. If you're willing to be vulnerable, if you like, oh my gosh, you know, I have no clue about this. Can you help me? There are a lot of little things, even more than what you say, that I think have a big impact. And that was just what I was going to say.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. As you were talking, I was thinking of Barbara, your amazing presentations that tell us about the importance of stance, gaze, how we articulate our words and how we take a stance, and what that can convey to people in terms of our interest or lack thereof. So thank you for teaching that to us all the time, Barbara, and Deborah, thank you for sharing that perspective. Dana has a point. So thank you, Dana, for that point in terms of making sure that if you choose to be a mentor, that you actually commit to the time and don't ghost your mentees, which I think is really important. You know, I think committing that time and giving a person the opportunity to succeed is really important. So, you know, small things can be really, really important here. I'll see if there's other questions. If not, we had a tiny little bit of a breakout discussion for you with a prompt to think about those areas in which maybe you've had experiences as well. Laureen, I see your hand, so I'll go to you first.
Hi, this is great. So thank you. I just had a kind of a question, you know, or just a statement, you know, I didn't even realize I asked people, hey, where are you from? And give me your background. And it's not like that I'm assuming things. It's just like for us to get to know each other. And maybe I should lead with, hey, let me tell you a bit about myself. I grew up in New York City and then moved to New Jersey. And so I didn't even realize that that could be perceived as being like me having assumptions about them. So this is helpful, but would you suggest like that's a better approach, is just to, hey, let me tell you a bit about myself, and I can weave in like my background, like where I grew up, and it's up to them if they want to talk about that. Is that a better way, you think?
Yeah, Lorraine, I think modeling that behavior and saying what's an acceptable way to sort of engage in this and open up opportunities for them to disclose as much or as little as they are comfortable with in that initial meeting. And then going forward, they might share more. But absolutely, I think, setting the tone of speaking first, modeling that kind of behavior, and then leaving it to them to share with you what they want to share. I think that's really important. And again, many of these things we say not to be intentionally exclusive. We're really trying to build rapport. It's just if we start by a set of assumptions around how that rapport might look, we might unintentionally create a lack of inclusion from the start where that's not what we intend. Absolutely. And I have done that. Having grown up all over the world, I still sometimes ask questions that I know better. And then I'll often backtrack and say, well, what I really wanted to ask you was this. So can we maybe start there? So absolutely. So thank you for raising that. Barbara, I see your hand, so I'll go to you.
Thank you. In answer to that last question, and also to pick up on something that Deb said, there are data in interpersonal communication that would indicate that the more we self-disclose, the more likely it is for the other person to self-disclose. So it's not all about you as the mentor, and it's not, let me tell you all about me, but it is to say that if I disclose something, so when someone says to me, where are you from? That's very complicated for someone who's adopted, right? Mm-hmm. And so just even disclosing that often gets people to understand me and my priorities better and helps them talk about things that maybe are less typical, whatever typical might be, but will give you guidance in how to communicate.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. And Fran, you bring up something in the chat that I would encourage everyone to think about. Sometimes the best way to kind of engage in culture or just sort of different perspectives is to read nonfiction. Like Americana by Chinando Amidze is an amazing book that kind of talks about that transnational journey of what it's like for people who kind of come from one place but end up in another and still go to a third place. So I think in that sense, our worldviews can actually be expanded by reading beyond our own sort of comfort level as well. So beyond just the academic text, I would say works of fiction and nonfiction can be quite helpful to get us to understand maybe perspectives that are very different than ours. I'm going to go to Rich, who says, any tips for when it's the other way around, when the mentee makes uncomfortable assumptions? I get the thought you're a man based on it. Absolutely, I would say, because they are going to, over time, have to engage with potentially investors, entrepreneurs, customers, and those kinds of assumptions that the reverse of what I was saying, essentially. So where your mentee makes you feel uncomfortable. I think those are absolutely teachable moments. I think of them as almost a responsibility because in some sense you've picked up on it. So as much as it might be discomfort or cause discomfort to you and be a difficult conversation, I think it is important that people understand that what they said made you uncomfortable, and potentially another way to think about it would be to get them to ask their question differently. I think that's really important, because if we don't address it, they'll just keep doing it. And at some point they'll just they won't get that call back ultimately at some point. I see, okay, I don't see another question. Yeah, and Deborah, so thank you. I think one of the ways in which we can think about inclusion is not always having an answer, and to let your mentee know that you don't have an answer, you don't have all the answers, but together maybe you can come up with answers. And again, part of the entrepreneurial journey is discovery. So what does that discovery look like? Is in a relationship where maybe one person simply doesn't have all the answers. And I believe one of the things we tell our students is that advising offers you data, and it's really up to you to understand how to put together all that data to move your venture forward. So some of it you may not love, you may not agree with, but it's important that you have a sense of how to assess these different points of view about what you're doing.
Banu, it was probably 8 years ago that one of my students said to me, you have it so together. How do you have it so together? And I was like, I don't have it together. But but what hit me was they said that, we look at you also as a role model. So we think we're going to have it together and we have to know the answers. And that totally changed how I mentored from that point on.
Yeah, and I suspect that, thank you so much, Deborah, for sharing that. And I suspect that many people kind of either have had or maybe will have that moment in which something clicks and you maybe pivot in how you think about mentoring and how you do mentoring, and engage with people. And as we get older, I think we change, right? I hate to admit it, but we are getting older. And I think our views of the world may be, shifting a little bit in terms of how we engage with people, especially as we look at, the students at Brown. They are getting absolutely more diverse. They are coming from a variety of backgrounds that maybe we traditionally don't have experience with or understand. And I think that's incredibly valuable for us to be able to learn from them and expand our ability to see the world differently.